much for being here today. Great to hear the buzz of conversation over the breakfast table. And tremendous you can join us here for the launch of 2022's Longevity Week. I'm Andrew Scott, and along with Jim Mellon and Fina Grabchi, we run the Longevity Forum. And I think you're in for a real treat this morning for our launch event. We've got a range of fantastic speakers. Thank you, the speakers who are here today, ranging across a broad range of topics that impact us as we think about the life course in a world of dealing with longer lives. But also, this is the launch of Longevity Week itself. We've got a fantastic set of events as well. And I want to thank all the individuals and institutions who have helped partner us with this week to make it so full of great and important initiatives. So Tina Woods and the National Innovation Centre of Ageing are having a great event this afternoon talking about the Quantum Health Longevity Initiative. George McGuinness from the UKRI having their event on healthy ageing tomorrow. UK Spine have coordinated with us to run the Science Summit at Oxford, because geroscience will be extremely important as we tackle the implications of longevity. That will require money, so we have Master Investor and the Longevity Biotech Association looking at how to finance that. But of course, it's not just about the science, it's also about behaviour and socio-economic factors. So the British Society of Gerontology are running a session about links with business and supporting older workers. On Friday morning, I'm delighted we have the National Academy of Medicine, Linda Fried from Columbia and John Wong from the National University of Singapore, who recently produced a global roadmap for healthy longevity. And they'll be here talking with UK experts about what it means for the UK. And our capstone closing the week is Richard Sue from King's with an event on data-driven longevity, because tech, of course, will play a role. And you can see in all those events both the breadth but also the range of topics needed as we tackle the longevity agenda. There's the economics, there's the finance, there's the science, the technology, and also the behavioural as well. Today marks also a special day. It's the 5th anniversary of the Longevity Forum, so I think we're out of the toddler years now. And it's been very gratifying. I think the progress has been made, not just in terms of the forum and the events we run, but just in terms of the broader agenda that all these institutions are helping to raise awareness. And for me, what the Longevity Forum has always been about is moving away from that tired and literally tired narrative of an ageing society that says the biggest challenge we've got is that there's more old people than young people. I think that is to miss the really, really fundamental change that has happened, which is that now the young and the middle-aged have a very high probability of becoming the very old. And that's about a forward-looking concept. It's about trying to move away from underestimating the capacity of older people and underestimating the capacity of our later years, and making sure that we adapt to these longer lives. We already have these longer lives, and for me, we need to achieve a 3-dimensional longevity dividend. We have these longer lives, we need to make them healthy for as long as possible and productive for as long as possible. And every previous investment in health and education has produced benefits for the economy and welfare, and we have to accept that the same holds true after 50. And if we don't, we fall foul of the ageing society narrative of underestimating the capacity of older people and the later years, and live in a self-reinforcing world where we fail to get the opportunities that longer life brings. Now, I said the agenda, it's a big agenda, and it's one I feel that alternative perspective is becoming more prominent. Bizarrely, I think COVID, to my surprise, in some ways has also been helpful. I mean, it's a terrible thing, COVID, and I'm fed up trying to find silver linings in COVID. It was just an awful experience. But it has, I think, made it paramount just how much we value health. We took steps which really significantly reduced the economy in order to invest in health. It made us aware of just how many older people there are already. But also, with diseases that affect older people more prominently, it showed very clearly the need to focus on prevention and not intervention. And then, of course, as we recover from COVID, as an economist, I find it really interesting that I'm trying to get Treasury and OBR to understand the productive potential of later years. And that isn't just about extending retirement age. People leave the labour market from 50 onwards. And now, of course, that is a first-order macroeconomic issue that's affecting inflation and GDP growth. Why is unemployment so low, but employment so low? And why are so many older workers withdrawing from the labour market? This is an issue that's going to get stronger and stronger. For me, ultimately, longevity is about 2 things. One is, it's about having more time. whatever your age, you have more years ahead of you than past generations. So whilst it really would be nice that 57, which is as old as I am, is the new 37, really 57 is just the new 57. We have more years ahead, whatever age you are, and we need to invest in that potential and put more resources to those later years. The other key feature of longevity is the malleability of how we age. One of the problems with the aging society is it assumes that we can't change how we age, and old people are a problem. First of all, they're not, but also, again, it underestimates the capacity of older people. So how do we exploit the malleability of age, and how do we age better? Now, geroscience is going to have a big part to play in that. We need more and more science and breakthroughs around the diseases of aging, but we know there's lots of things we can do in our behaviours and our environment to age better, which is, as you can see, I'm finally getting around to introducing our first speaker of today, the Right Honourable Michael Gove, who's the Secretary of State for Levelling Up and Housing and Communities. Because the downside of malleability, there's an upside, we can age better, is that if we don't do certain things, we don't age well, we may even deteriorate in how we age. And the evident inequality in terms of longevity and health that the UK and the US and many other countries have is testimony to the malleability of age. And of course the importance of making sure that we age better by tackling that inequality. I have to say, introducing Michael is rather difficult because you all know Michael. He's been one of the most influential public figures of recent decades. He's, I hope he doesn't mind me saying, roughly the same age as me. And if he is going to have a 100-year life, he must wonder what on earth's going to happen in the next few decades, given all the changes that have happened over the last 10 years or so. So I'm not going to go much into what Michael's career has done, but I'm going to just pick a few biographical facts that anchor us to longevity and levelling up, and explain why we're just so delighted that he can spend some time today talking about his work. So Michael, as you probably know, was born in Scotland, Aberdeen to be precise, where life expectancy is 79. He then went on to study at Oxford at Lady Margaret Hall, where life expectancy is about 3.5 years better, 82.5 years. In 2005, he was elected as the MP for Surrey Heath. I can't get life expectancy numbers for Surrey Heath. I can get them for Surrey, and it's 83.5, one more year in Oxford. So Michael's journey is increasing life expectancy at every step. And of course, as an MP, he works at the Palace of Westminster, where Westminster has the highest life expectancy in the country. And there, I'm not talking about the Houses of Parliament per se, but just Westminster in general, which has a life expectancy of 86. So that's a 7-year difference in life expectancy between Aberdeen and Westminster. And those differences in life expectancy are even larger in terms of healthy life expectancy. And those are averages. If you look within the averages and look at the spread, there are extraordinary differences across regions. And as an economist, I think levelling up is incredibly important, and we often see it in terms of income and GDP. But of course, health is a very key part of how we measure welfare, but also health is an extremely important input to how we get the economy to succeed. So we couldn't have a better speaker to talk about issues of the malleability of age and longevity than Michael. But there's another reason why I think it's great that Michael has agreed to come and talk to us today. One of the things I think is very challenging about the longevity agenda is it affects everything. It's cross-departmental. And of course, government is structured around a previous version of life where we separate out education, we separate health, we separate work, pensions. We need all of these to come together if we're going to tackle longevity, just as we need them all to come together to tackle levelling up. And Michael's also the Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, so I think can provide another great perspective. So thank you so much for being here today, and a thank you too for Michael. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. As so often in my life, I feel a bit of a fraud. Why on earth should I be talking about longevity? What potential credentials do I have to talk about it? And then I reflected briefly, and I thought there is one thing I can boast, which is that I have been a government minister under 4 different prime ministers. But then I realised what was, a generation ago, a formidable claim to fame is now a, yeah, so what? You wait years for 3 prime ministers to come along, and then suddenly in 1 year. I also feel a fraud because there are people around this table, around these tables, who have direct experience in government dealing with some of the issues that matter most when we're thinking about longevity. In particular, the very distinguished health ministers here, like my friend Lord Bethel, Jim Bethel. And I've never been a minister in the Department of Health. I should say, however, that one of the most recent incumbents as Secretary of State for Health is demonstrating some admirable principles when it comes to longevity. He's showing the vital importance of daily exercise and a high-protein diet in making sure that you can survive in one of the most competitive environments on Earth. But one of the reasons why, as we've just heard, I do have a locus, not as an individual, but as a minister in discussing longevity, is the department for which I'm currently responsible, deals with, at its essence, the inequalities that scar our country. And if we look at the United Kingdom, we can be proud of the United Kingdom in many ways, proud of its constituent nations, proud of what they've achieved, proud of our National Health Service, proud of the commitment that it shows towards innovation overall. But one of the things that scars our country, one of the things that makes it an outlier in comparison to other countries which are similarly wealthy, similarly successful, is the extent to which inequality, particularly geographical inequality, marks our society. And one of the most marked ways in which that geographical inequality expresses itself is in public health and indeed, as we've just heard, in longevity. Not just in terms of years lived, but also in terms of the quality of life that people enjoy. In health, we have a particular measure, the quality adjusted life year. But however you determine the both length of someone's life, but also the quality of that life, then the stark realities of inequalities hit you whenever you look at a map of the United Kingdom. If you look at the gap between those local authorities and its local authority data, that is the most reliable that we have. If you look at the gap between the 5 worst local authorities for length of time on this planet and the best, it is remarkable. It's remarkable how big the gap is, 12 years, but it's also remarkable where those areas are. So the 5 least healthy local authorities are Glasgow, Dundee, Blackpool, Inverclyde and West Dunbartonshire. It is striking, perhaps this is a reason why I should be speaking here, that 4 out of those 5 are in Scotland. There are particular reasons for that, which I may touch on in a second. But of course, the most striking thing is that the 5 which are the most healthy are, as we've just heard, Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea, Camden, Harrow, and Rutland. So a striking thing. Scotland and Blackpool, or in particular the West Central Belt and the industrial city of Dundee, Blackpool. And then the very heart of central London, that is where the biggest gap exists. And that reinforces a truth about geographical inequality in our country, which is that the sand, the golden sand, has gone to the bottom of the egg timer. The striking thing about the United Kingdom is that London is a global city par excellence. London, the southeast and the east of England, the area around the Golden Triangle of Oxford, Cambridge and London is super successful. Super successful in terms of economic productivity, super successful actually in terms of education. London is the only capital city in the developed world where the schools are better than in the rest of the country, and super successful, as I say, in terms of research and development, in terms of economic opportunity, and also, therefore, in terms of health. Similarly, if you look at the most deprived parts of the United Kingdom, those with the worst life expectancy, you will also find that educational attainment is either stagnant or moving backwards. You'll find that productivity, with some exceptions, and there are always exceptions, is lower. You'll find that the degree of investment in research and development is sparse and sporadic, and you'll find life expectancy is lower too. Now, the really striking thing is that they should be connected. There's no intrinsic reason why those parts of a nation that happen to be more economically productive should also be healthier, but that's the way it is in the United Kingdom. So when we think about improving economic productivity overall, we've also got to think about health as well. So it's perfectly possible to take a cynical and utilitarian view and to argue that public health or longevity doesn't matter, it's a roll of the dice, it's there in the DNA, there's very little that we can do about it as policymakers. But even if you are the most cynical, utilitarian, Hayekian figure, and there's no one like that in this room, let alone in the Conservative Party or in the wider think tank world around us. But if you were in that position, then you would care about public health. You would want people to lead longer and more productive lives because they would be less of a strain on the NHS, consume fewer tax pounds in keeping the health system going. They would also be adding to your GDP. They would be more productive for longer. So my job, or one of my jobs, along with my colleagues, Levelling Up, is about addressing precisely that. Now, one of the things about Levelling Up is that there is no single intervention. Just as with health, there is no one answer to the question of why and how we have such an unequal society and how we can overcome it. One of the things that we need to do is to recognise that you need to pool a variety of levers. So in the same way as, and as I say, I'm no health expert, anyone who's seen my lifestyle would know that, but in the same way as I appreciate that when it comes to improving an individual's health, you need to think about diet, you need to think about exercise, you need to think about quality of relations, you need to think about emotional and mental well-being alongside the sheer physical inputs into the body. So when you're thinking about why it is that there are some areas that are left behind and some others that are successful, you need to think about that mix of interventions that helps overall. So the single most important one, but we mustn't allow it to dwarf all others, is simply the quality of education, the investment in human capital, the extent to which individuals have the capacity to be authors of their own life story, to determine their own future. And again, there's a strong connection, a causative connection, not a perfect one, but a very strong one, again, between educational attainment and longevity. Many of you may be readers of the Times. There's a brilliant article in the Times today about the illiteracy gap between Stockton and Oxfordshire, between the northeast and the southeast. And again, one of the points it makes is that in those parts of the country where literacy levels are lower, then life expectancy is lower. Not just a connection in terms of poverty, but also a connection in terms of people's ability to navigate their way through, acquire the information, and make the judgments that will mean that they have longer and more productive lives. So that's the first, but it's very far from being the only thing. You also need to think about the degree of connectivity between those parts of the country that are at the end of the branch line, as it were, but connectivity within those communities as well. So when we think about connectivity, we often think about digital connectivity and those big infrastructure projects, HS2 and so on. They're very important. But just as important in its own way is the deeply unglamorous subject of bus travel. Because if you look at communities like the city of Bradford, if you look at the way in which individuals in Bradford suffer poorer health outcomes and poorer economic outcomes, it's often because the simple daily public transport connections that allow people within that city or within that urban area to get to the jobs and the opportunities that they need just isn't there. So everything from how children are taught in the early years to how frequent the bus service is, all of these things contribute to addressing inequality. Some of the things that contribute to addressing inequality are within the hands of central government, but a great many of them, a growing number, are in the hands of local leaders. So if you take somewhere like Manchester, which is one of the areas that is catching up fastest, our second city in every sense and a success story, part of what is improving Manchester is investment in education. It has a growing student population, improving schools, world-class universities, and more investment in research and development. But another thing is a connected transport system. The mayor there, Andy Burnham, is trying to do for transport in Manchester and across the Greater Manchester area what's already been done in London. So improving transport, improving education, improving local leadership. All of these need to come together. Now, in our department, we've come up with a phrase to describe this. It is a poncy, wonky, think-tanky, intellectually pretentious phrase, which is why I love it. We call it the Medici model. Because if you look at the cities that were successful in Renaissance Italy, when it moved from being essentially a medieval country to a modern one, or certainly an early modern one, what was characteristic about all of the cities that were driving economic growth at that time is there was a celebration of educational endeavor. There was a recognition that the way in which the cities were built and how people came together mattered. Prestige was attached both to innovation, but also to civic generosity. Local leadership mattered as well. So you need to bring all of these things together. When it comes to an individual's diet, you cannot rely on one foodstuff alone. when it comes to the success required for levelling up, again, you need to have all of the ingredients in the buffet, otherwise you won't have the degree of growth that you require. Just two other things briefly before I hand over to all of you for questions and answers, or questions on your part, and I'll try and give some answers. And the two other brief things are, we're talking about addressing inequality in order to provide people with longer and more fulfilling lives. It is critically important that we recognise that they are fulfilling as well. And this takes me to one particular point which we touched on earlier. One of the consequences of COVID, one of the consequences of what we've been through is an acceleration of the focus on the way in which individuals tend to opt out or drop out of the labour market when they still have so many more years to offer. It has been the case, it's noticeable, though we don't know the exact proportions of it, that more people chose as a result of COVID in their 50s and 60s to say, right, that's it. I don't want to live a rat-laced life anymore. I've found actually during lockdown a slower pace of life, stopping to smell the flowers, that is more attractive. And I can completely understand that. But it is the case that as more people are living longer lives, the idea that there should be a protracted period when they are disengaged from the labour market is bad for the economy, but also bad for them. If you want people to stay not just alive, but lively and engaged, then we need to make sure that there is purposeful activity available to them that meets their lifestyle where it is and provides them with an opportunity to continue to be creative. And we're still wrestling with precisely how to do that. The second thing that I was going to say is, and this comes very much home for me in the area for which I'm responsible most prominently, which is the housing market, is that we have a model of housing in the UK. I mean, there are many things one can say about the model of housing, but one of the things is that essentially the model has been in the past that overall you get a better and better and better house, and then at the end you pass it on to your children, or you pass as much of it on to your children as possible, with some of it having gone on the costs of social care. But that model is faulty for at least two reasons. One, we know that social care is a lottery. Those who may need significant amounts of money being spent on them in their final declining years, generally, but not always as a result of dementia. It is the fickle finger of fate that will pick out any one of us as succumbing to that. We know that there are certain other factors which increase the likelihood of dementia, but it is, to an extent, a genetic lottery. That means that there is inherent inequality built into the system. That's why we need reform of the social care system, but that's expensive and difficult, as we all know. The second thing is we also want to be in a position where we make it easier for people to downsize. If people are going to live for longer, if children are going to move from the nest, if people are going to have decades of additional lifestyle where sometimes their mobility might be lesser, but their brains are just as sharp and they want to contribute just as much, we need to move towards a style of retirement living which is not simply the sheltered housing of the past. It is people moving to smaller dwellings which allow them to live in comfort, but also to live in a community which caters for their needs. And if we do that, and if we can think about providing housing of that kind, then we can free up both our housing stock and our capital in order to ensure that those who are not yet on the property ladder can move up, and it also ensures that people can release the capital that they've accumulated during their lives and see it spent arguably more productively. So just a few observations. As I say, I have no expertise or knowledge on anything that relates to longevity. All I've done is, as all politicians do, talk about how important what it is that they're doing at the moment might be. But what I am doing is incredibly important, and that's why I'm so grateful to have the chance to talk to this distinguished group of people here this morning. And can I say a particular thank you, not just to Jim Ellum for organising the Longevity Forum, but also for the person who was kind enough to invite me here today, Joanne Black from Parent Gym, an organisation committed to tackling inequality at root in the very first years of children's lives by making sure that all of us can learn to be better parents. If we're better parents, and we ensure at the very beginning of children's lives that they have the ability to make the most of all of their talents, then that contributes so much to our society. So thank you to Jim, and thank you to Joanne. Thank you.
Some questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Who would like to start us off? Yeah. Louise.
Hi, I'm Dr. Louise Easton, I'm a GP and medical specialist. My name is. There's a comment and a question. Your areas of deprivation actually match where HRT is prescribed, hormone replacement therapy, which is really harrowing. In some areas, only 2% of women are given it, despite a nice guy 7 years ago saying the majority of women will benefit. Also, I'm really interested to know if anyone's thinking about NHS actually, because we know 40% of the NHS workforce are menopausal women. We know around 10% of women giving up their jobs because of memory problems, fatigue, and also anxiety. So it's not about changing their uniform or changing the temperature. So 10% of 40% of a massive employer is a real worry, and I just wondered whether that's on your radar when you're thinking about people in their 40s and 50s.
It is very much on my radar, and I think that, again, in general terms, it is the case that as society becomes more honest about certain things, so it is the case that surfaced or below the radar health questions and challenges become more salient, and therefore we are better able to deal with them. And I just mentioned two, one of which I alluded to very briefly. I think well-being in its broadest sense, i.e. mental health, which poor mental health that affects us, that is short of a full-blown condition, that is full depression or being bipolar or living with a psychosis. Being more aware of how to have better mental health and the impact of poor mental health on all of us as individuals and on the economy, that has grown in the last 5 or 10 years. We have to be wary about medicalising every condition, but that is undoubtedly the case. But the second area, thanks to some fantastic work by a variety of women who have written and spoken honestly about the challenges that they face, is that we understand much better the impact of the menopause on individuals' lives, on the institutions in which they work. And as you quite rightly point out, one of the things that we need to do is to build up a richer data picture of those workforces and those geographies that are most affected by it. And I agree with you that I remember when Theresa Gorman, I don't know if anyone remembers this very sort of outspoken, that in itself is probably a sexist term, but still, a Conservative MP in the 1980s and 1990s, explained the impact that HRT had had on her life. And at the time, the media coverage made it seem as though this was some sort of eccentric choice by a virago to try to maintain her youth and vigour, when in fact, it is an absolutely necessary medical intervention in order to ensure that people can lead full lives. I think we're in a far better place overall in terms of the public conversation, but is public policy where it needs to be? No.
We have an in-house question, as it were, from Lord Jim Bethell.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for the ringing endorsement you gave to the agenda. Could you say a few words about the politics of this? And you did just allude to it in the answer you just gave. I mean, you're right that public health concerns are below the radar. And in fact, in health terms, they are drowned out by a political narrative that is very focused on building hospitals, providing enough nurses, keeping waiting lists down. These are input measures for the sickness system.
Yes.
Rather than public health concerns around mental health, around vaccines, around diagnostics, around the prevention agenda. Now, during COVID, we found that the public were very concerned about vaccines. They were much more interested in vaccines than they were about therapies and diagnostics. How do we change that? How can politicians back out of the cul-de-sac they're in?
Yes. Well, I think it is difficult. I think there is actually, I have to be honest, I think that there is a slightly bigger problem on what one might call the centre-right. And I exempt you, Jim, and a number of other people from it. But broadly, when it comes to health overall, the sort of default centre-right position is NHS is a good thing, it needs to be managed better. It's about efficiency within the NHS, purchaser-provider splits. Do we have the right scale when we're thinking about the way in which this service operates? Are we incentivising the right outcomes within the system? All of which is absolutely right. But when it comes to public health interventions, the sense is, that's a bit nannyish. So if we're going to go into the area of diet, if we're going to talk about mental health, this is the sort of area that We, on the macho, hard-talking, tough decisions, we're up for the difficult questions that the country faces, right, shy away from. And you saw something of that in the debate over COVID and after COVID. One of the things that I find, and please forgive me for straying into a personal area, one of the things that I found disturbing about broadly the media, but also many of my political colleagues on the centre-right, is the way in which their reaction to lockdown was, whoa, horrid, anti-libertarian, and all the rest of it. And they weren't thinking about the health of the population overall. They were privileging their own emotional reaction to lockdown over the intellectual, rational argument for it at the time. Now, we can argue about whether or not it was overdone and so on, but there's no developed country in the world that didn't have a variety of restriction on social mixing in order to deal with it. And similarly, when you then went on to the conversation about why the UK had, at certain points, a higher level of mortality and excess death than other countries, and you looked at things like poor housing and obesity, then other people on the centre-right shrank away from that. You're trying to intervene in the housing market? What's that got to do with health? Obesity? It's my sovereign right to eat as many Frosties as I want, and so on. And so part of the challenge, I think, for us is to have a more developed conversation on the centre-right about what interventions are wise and right, to respect individual liberty, but at the same time to say, we've got a responsibility to lead. And then I think the broader thing as well is if we have that honest conversation with ourselves, it is easier for us, if we're in power or in positions of influence, to have a conversation with others when they're saying, why aren't you spending more on this? Why aren't you spending more on that in terms of inputs? And we can say, yeah, that's important, but you have to look at health in a holistic way. And I think the other thing I would say is that there are an emerging generation of thinkers in public policy who are not principally health experts, who are doing more of this. As well as yourself, you're the people that we both know, like Henry Dimbleby and Dolly Thies and others, who are people who are enriching that conversation, and I think giving them just as much space as the people who are technical experts in the purchase-provider split is the right thing to do.
Now, one of the ironies about longer life is we've always run out of time, but we have perhaps time for one more question.
I'll take the two, those two there, take them together, and then I'll try and answer them briefly.
Could you just talk a little, I'm my own vein, I'm talking right about young people's finances. Could you talk a little bit about the efforts that you're making around improving the quality of housing and how that can happen without necessarily compromising the quantity of housing, which of course is a huge
Yes.
affecting young people, and you've been working hard to rectify the problems around planning, etc. So, yeah, speaking a bit about the efforts to
Yes.
improve quality of housing.
Yes.
My question was another political one, which is if you're successful at levelling up, I presume almost all areas of that will be politically positive, boosting GDP per capita in less well-off areas. When it comes to longevity, if that leads to more levelling up, there's presumably down the line a tough political aspect where you're going to have to ask people to work for longer.
Yes.
Which even if that's positive for them in the country long term, how difficult will that be, do you think, in a communication PR aspect over the next few years to tell people, probably also those less well off as well, that they're going to have to work longer if you boost the retirement age?
Yes. Okay. Both of these questions reinforce a point made by the American economist Thomas Sowell, which is that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Again, if we wanted simply to maximize the number of new homes being built, then we would accept the premise that some of the volume house builders take, which is never mind the quality, just feel the sheer tsunami of land being consumed in order to generate new homes. And as we know, poor quality housing, housing that is not just poorly built, but aesthetically unappealing, and which doesn't have the public safety features, and which is not environmentally built to the highest standards, contributes to a series of poor outcomes, including, as we've seen, particularly through overcrowding, poor public health outcomes. So one of the things that we do need to do is operate in a way which both seeks to unlock new homes, and that's difficult given our particular planning system, which is in itself a problem for 101 reasons, but also at the same time as doing that, also make sure that in the existing stock, everyone from social landlords to private landlords to the developers themselves have a care for the quality of what's happening? Well, one thing I would say is that there are no easy answers here. I never thought I would say this, but I do recommend Lewis Goodall on this. Those of you who are aware that Lewis now works for LBC will be aware that there is a new podcast called The News Agents, which has Emily Maitlis and John Sopel joining him. There's a recent podcast just last week, 35 minutes. It explores the particular challenge that people have in the private rented sector. What's good about it is that it exposes that there is no easy answer to the difficulties that we face in what is the fastest growing part of the housing market. On Wilfred's point, yes, you're absolutely right, and there are at least two problems. One is that we just have to have a conversation about state retirement and retirement age overall, and that is difficult. And the second one underlying that is that, in essence, the baby boomer generation have done net very well out of a series of public policy interventions and the growth of the economy during the time that they were productive. Now times are tougher temporarily. We know in particular that there's a generational problem for younger people. Housing is one of the biggest areas, but not the only area. It is difficult to afflict the comfortable in order to comfort the afflicted. But one of the things that we do need to do is to turn the conversation around in a way that people like the Longevity Forum are, so that it is less about come on, away from your garden, your park, and your peaceful existence, back into the workforce, like some Nibelung being forced back down the mines. We've got to change the conversation, so it is about making the most of those additional years, and politicians can't do it on their own, which is why we need good people like all of you gathered here today.